Five of the Best is an opinion-based series on films which I have seen released during the chosen year. This is to celebrate previous years in film, not to cause any offence. All opinions are my own. Hi everyone, welcome back to 5 of the Best, a series in which we celebrate movies year by year. This series will consist of me discussing my 5 favourite films from this chosen year. And this year is 2020. Now before we get started, before we get into the Honourable Mentions, I should say that no matter where you lived, you know that we didn't get a lot of movie releases this year for a certain reason. You know what I'm talking about. So, with the very little movie releases we did get, let's get into the Honourable Mentions. Before we get into your top 5, here is the smallest Honourable Mentions of all time. Because there was barely any movies. Soul. And onward. Now, let's get on to the list and start with number 5. The Invisible Man is directed and written by Leigh Whannell and stars Elizabeth Moss. So starting off talking about 2020, we start with the film that I saw last before the cinemas closed, which is The Invisible Man. A movie that I knew very little about going into. The only knowledge I had of anything to do with the film was the director, which is Leigh Whannell, which of course has such a hand and he's such a name in horror of the last 10 to 20 years. Obviously written and directed by him in this instance. Films like Upgrade in more recent times, in like 2018, had such a big hand in the Insidious series, and then all the way back to the first Saw film, which is written and directed and stars him. I am a fan of Leigh Whannell's. Not everything is a swing and a miss. Not everything's a swing and a hit, and not everything's a swing and a miss. It's quite a... He's got good and he's got bad. But I have to say, when he does things well, he does things very well. And I would certainly class The Invisible Man in that category, because this movie is so much more than just an interesting premise. And a premise that is as old as cinema, nearly. If you think about the original Invisible Man, which is like almost 100 years old, maybe 80 years old, the original one in black and white, that isn't the similar, it is by name, but the premise is quite different. This is a modern take on it, whereas then it's like a chemical that means he turns invisible. We had other movies in the 90s, things like Hollow Man, which kind of share similar principles in maybe more of a darker way. But Invisible Man in this is more of a technology. It's a bit like a Black Mirror episode, if you get what I mean when I talk about that. And having someone like Elizabeth Moss in the lead, who, I'll be completely transparent with you, I am not too well versed in her catalogue of work. I know she's in The Handmaid's Tale, the television show. I've never seen an episode of it, I just know that's one of the reasons she's known for, and she's so good. But after watching this, I was a fan, and I am a fan of hers. I think she brings great emotion, great intrigue, and great willingness to root for her as the lead character in this. I found The Invisible Man a really, really enjoy. I wouldn't really call it a horror. I would call it more of a thriller than a horror. It's not, you wouldn't be terrified by this movie in any way, but it does have some horror elements. A few jump scares that are quite effective. It isn't cheap. There isn't actually any element of this film that feels cheap. The Invisible Man, I thought, was a really, really interesting... And I know there is that whole thing about the monster universe. You know, the Tom Cruise Mummy, which is like a terrible movie that was supposed to start this kind of spin-off franchise and include The Invisible Man, which is supposed to be played, I believe, by Johnny Depp. Is that right? And then it just became its own entity by itself. I'm actually glad it did, because that Tom Cruise Mummy was not good. Not good at all. And this movie is surprisingly good, and people look at 2020 as a whole, and that'll be kind of the theme of this episode, talking about the year 2020, but people think of this time as there wasn't any quality around this time. The cinema closed, and we just got nothing. But this movie definitely breaks that mold, and I really think that The Invisible Man is one of the better thrillers since the year 2020 that we've seen. Would I be interested in a sequel? I don't know that the story lends to a sequel. I think it's good as a one and done. But overall, I was very, very impressed with Invisible Man. And when I did go and see it, this is more just on a personal level, but when I did go and see it, I went with a group of friends, and we had just signed up to a monthly pass for our local cinema, which is, you know, you pay a certain amount in subscription fee and you get a ticket to every movie. We thought, this is great. We'll get to go to the cinema all the time. We'll get to go every week, and there'll be lots of movies, and they'll all be as good as The Invisible Man. And that didn't happen. Because, well, you know what happened. The world stopped for a while, and we didn't get that. But ending that period of cinema for me, that just before the cinemas closed, and this was the last movie I seen, it was a good one to end on, and it kept my intrigue, and it kept my want for the cinema to be reopened again. So I put a lot down to The Invisible Man, not just it being just above the quality that I thought it would be. I have to say, when I seen it, I didn't know much about Elizabeth Moss. I know Lee Winnell has a kind of maybe 60-40 batting average when it comes to movies, so I didn't really go in with the highest of hopes, but I was very pleasantly surprised, and that's why I would definitely recommend The Invisible Man if you get a chance to see it. Number 4. The Trial of the Chicago 7 is directed by Aaron Sorkin and stars Eddie Redmayne and Sacha Baron Cohen, along with others. So here it is, the first and actually only streaming movie of this year, just with the way things worked out. And for the 3-1, you'll understand why, and I'll give my reasons, but for the only straight to Netflix movie, or straight to any streaming site, although you probably could class Soul in that in the Honourable Mentions. But Trial of the Chicago 7 is a movie that I knew very little about going into. I didn't know the backstory, I didn't know anything about the true story behind it, and of course it is based on a true story. I just seen a good cast, a good list of cast members, people like Eddie Redmayne, who I am a massive fan of after something like The Theory of Everything, the Stephen Hawkins film. Sacha Baron Cohen, who is a good comedy actor, but I don't think I'd ever seen him in something so serious before. And I mean, there is quite a strong cast here throughout. So, going into this, I'll admit, I turned this on and I put this film on to watch because I needed a fix. I needed to see a movie. I needed to see something on Netflix or something that was just going to keep me ticking over. And I don't really like, I know some people are different, but I have to say I love the movie experience in the cinema. I don't really think I'm a massive fan of watching movies at home unless it's a rewatch, and that's a different scenario altogether. However, in a scenario like this, I was happy enough to go into this and just give it the chance watching it at home. And I was very pleased I did. I found this a really interesting, what I would describe as political film. And I'm not a politics guy, I'm not really interested in politics in kind of any capacity, just to any high level of degree. But I do have to say that this movie is a really intriguing one. You know, you get those films where if you really buy into the dialogue and you really listen intently to every moment and every part of everything that everybody's saying in the film, it's a really rewarding experience. I think this is one of the better iterations of that in recent times. I think that there isn't any wasted dialogue, and you could say that about so many films, but something about the Trial of Chicago 7, it doesn't have these big action scenes to fall back on, and it's not like you're leading from action scene to action scene, or horror scene to horror scene, or comedy beat to comedy beat. This film relies solely on interesting dialogue and dynamic between characters, whether that's chemistry between characters, whether that's them antagonising each other, whether it's a judge and a jury, whether it's a prosecution, whether it's all of this. And if you're into your kind of courtroom dramas, not to say that this is the greatest courtroom drama film of all time, not anywhere near it, but I do think that The Trial of Chicago 7 is one of the more... And again, what I said there about The Invisible Man, it's one of the more forgotten films of this era. People just think, 2020 was rubbish for films because we didn't get anything and the cinemas were closed, so we just write that year off completely. That's not true. And I think in both of these, in Trial of Chicago 7 and The Invisible Man, they're both films that I look back on very fondly. And Trial of Chicago 7 in particular was a film that came out after the lockdown began, after everything was closed and after we got into the period of settling in our own houses and watching things, whether that be television series, whether that be movies or playing games or whatever. I think Trial of Chicago 7 is the one for 2020 that went straight to DVD. That's not even true, is it? It went straight to DVD. That makes you sound so old. May as well be saying straight to video, VHS. No, straight to streaming, I should say. Jesus. And really, it was definitely the crowning achievement for 2020, I thought, when it comes to streaming. Because yes, you have certain films that did get released in the cinema before that and then went to streaming and they were good, probably like The Invisible Man. But I do think The Trial of Chicago 7 is one of those ones, if you really buckle in and you really listen intently, it's one of the more rewarding experiences of movies from 2020. I would definitely recommend it. And also, when we're talking about performances, while I wouldn't say it's Eddie Redmayne's best performance ever, I already said what I thought he was fantastic in, which was The Theory of Everything. Sacha Baron Cohen really surprised me in this, I have to say. Not that his role is totally front and centre at all times, but he, in a more serious role, actually brings quite a lot to this. And that was maybe the biggest shock of this film as a whole, because the rest of the actors and actresses in this, you already know what they're going to bring. But in his case, you know, to see Borat or Bruno or any of those real, or Ali G, or any of these really memorable comedic characters that he's had, to be in such a serious role, I really got a lot out of that, I have to say. But yeah, not just that, but overall, there's so much to love in The Trial of Chicago 7. It's a film that has a very important point to make as well. Not just about the scenario this talks about, but kind of as the justice system as a whole around that time. It's a really interesting movie. It maybe isn't for everyone. I would preface by saying that. I don't think that everybody would enjoy this. But certainly if you're in that way inclined to something to do with politics, or that way to do with like courtroom dramas, or films of that ilk, this could be right up your alley. Number 3. The Gentleman is directed by Guy Ritchie and starred Matthew McConaughey, Charlie Hunnam, and Hugh Grant. Now you might be saying to yourself, hang on a minute, that was not released in 2020, that was released in 2019. Not technically. Here in the UK and Ireland, they released it in January. So yes, I'm getting very lucky with that. That also applies to another entry on this list that we'll get to. I've been very lucky, let's just say. When it comes to talking about 5 great movies of 2020, I have been very lucky about whenever I got to see them. But early in January 2020, I got to see The Gentleman, directed by Guy Ritchie, which I really appreciate so many of his movies. Way back to things like Lock, Stock, and Two Smoking Barrels, things like Snatch, which actually has already appeared on 5 of the Best. There's movies by him that are kind of not so good, but when they're done well, a bit like what I said when I was talking about Leigh Whannell, when Guy Ritchie gets it right, my god does he get it right. And in The Gentleman, it's instantly one of his best. I think between The Gentleman and Snatch, they're my 2 favourite films by him. And in this one, in The Gentleman, you have a stacked cast. You have Matthew McConaughey, who, what do I need to add talking about McConaughey nowadays? He is the man, and certainly in this era of film, kind of everything from Interstellar up to this point, he is one of the main guys. Add to that Charlie Hunnam coming hot off the heels of Sons of Anarchy, and him being such a beloved actor here in the UK, and even just in general. And then Hugh Grant. Now let's talk a little bit about Hugh Grant. And to talk about Hugh Grant, I always, and for valid reason, I always think of him as the rom-com guy. The early 90s up to kind of maybe even early 2000s. That kind of romance drama British films that he was always in. And there wasn't really any time he would have really broke that mould. Not to any notable level. Things like Love Actually, even, you know, you've got things like that are always kind of... I just put it this way, I never thought Hugh Grant would have been in this kind of role, as kind of like a snivelly detective is probably too generic of a word for it, like kind of undercover paparazzi is probably the best way to put it. He is one of the best parts of this film. Even his voice, the way he tells the tale, the narrative, and that's kind of the overarching point of why I love The Gentleman so much. It has one of the most exciting narratives of all of Guy Ritchie's films. Because, you know, and in Snatch and in all of the, really, that's kind of a staple of his directing and his movie making, which is there's always different parts of the stories all going on at once. And yes, on a very generic level, you can base that on every film that exists. Well, near enough every film that exists. There's always a lot of different plot narratives with different characters. But as a big overarching story that has lots of interesting characters, there isn't a part of any, really, of Guy Ritchie's stories that are good, like Snatch, like this, like Lock, Stock, Two Smoking Barrels, even like Rock and Rolla. I know he had a hand in that. You know, when you look at these films, not just the front and center story is interesting, not just the characters at the front are brilliant. Every character has its own story, has its own depth, and the best example of that in this is actually Colin Farrell. Now, Colin Farrell is, you know, all the way back to In Bruges, which I talked a little bit about before, about how much I loved his performance in that and his dynamic between him and Brendan Gleeson in that, which of course would lead on to their reuniting in the Banshees of Inisherin. So he really can do chemistry and charisma well. But him as the coach in The Gentleman, who is, for all intents and purposes, a side character, or a glorified side character, if you like, he is one of the most memorable side characters in recent memory. His performance, along with the lead of Matthew McConaughey, I love The Gentleman. I just think it's one of the coolest films, and I know I use that term, and I know it's quite a loose term, but I think there's no better way to describe it. You know, the English mafia scenarios running about London, they're, when done right, and when done essentially by Guy Ritchie, whenever he gets it right, they can be some of the most entertaining movies you'll ever see. And I do think The Gentleman was, you know, when I talked about 2019 there in the previous episode, I do think that if I had have seen this in November or whatever it was released in the States, I think it probably would have made an appearance in some form anyway. I'm so glad that it got to make its way onto a list, and I got to talk about it in a specific level because it's so good. It's so good. And yes, it doesn't have maybe the traction that Interstellar had for McConaughey for obvious reasons, and of course it's a far superior film, but I just think there's so much that I think everybody would really enjoy this. If you do like things like Peaky Blinders, you do like things like Legend with Tom Hardy, and there's a lot of films like that and stories and series like that, but The Gentleman's just one of the better iterations in recent times, and I really, really loved it. Every performance is great. The story keeps you on the edge of your seat, as cliche as that sounds, at all times. There isn't a story beat that's boring. There isn't a part of the movie where you're checked out. It never stops. Never stops. And for me, that's the kind of movie I love. And that's why The Gentleman's just a great time. Number 2. The Father is directed by Florian Zeller and stars Anthony Hopkins and Olivia Colman. So from an upbeat and exciting gangster film to a bit more of a somber note, The Father is truly one of the most beautiful films I have seen in a long time. And not beautiful because it's a really happy film or a really inspiring film. What this film is, and while it's based on it's an adaptation of a theatre production, but for it to be so hard-hitting and so grounded in reality, and having the quality of Sir Anthony Hopkins and Olivia Colman in some of their best roles ever, and I mean, talking about Anthony Hopkins, for example, that is no small feat. For him to put in a performance like this, after having a long career that spans so many decades, and he's been fantastic in all of them, to put in a performance like this, he is just wonderful. The movie is wonderful, but it's wonderful in a way. You know, when I said there about it isn't happy. It isn't. But what it is, it's emotional. You will likely be quite teary by the end of this film, and actually throughout it. Because in most films of this ilk, you would have a story and the narrative be from one of the characters looking after Anthony Hopkins' character. Of course, dealing with dementia and everything that comes with that. And it is a heartbreaking tale. But to see it through the eyes of the father, of Sir Anthony Hopkins in this, and the scenario he is in and how he feels, it is one of the smartest. I mean, I haven't seen the theatre production, so I can't say I don't know how much differs to the big screen from the theatre screen or the theatre stage. I just think this movie is, I can't think of any other word than a masterpiece in what it does. And I just think that it really touched a nerve with me, and I'm sure if you felt, whether it's grandparents or you've been in a scenario of any kind of similar nature with family or friends that are in a scenario like this, or have an ailment that is to this level, it really hits a nerve. And I don't want to take it too serious, because I'm not really, I'm here to celebrate movies, and I really do, and I have to put this on there because it's one of those films that I would sing the praises to the high heavens. I think this movie is just fantastic at what it does. It does not pull any punches, as I say. It is emotional throughout. The scenario that you could put in as an audience member is engrossing. There is no point, and I've said this about some of the movies today, but none more than this. There is not a point of this movie where you will be checked out. It is a short film too. It is not a long 3-4 hour film. It delivers its dialogue, it delivers its story in a precise and concise way, and also it doesn't hold back on anything, as I say. I really, really love The Father as a film. I actually got seeing it later than it actually was released. I think it was around the start of the year, and it might have actually fell into the category of it was released previously in 2019, but by the time I got seeing it and by the time it came here to see, it was 2020. And for this movie, I sat alone watching the movie, and I just found it very emotional from start to finish, really. From the first scene to the ending scene. This movie is a thrill ride of emotion, not a thrill ride of action, not a thrill ride of, dialogue and quirky charisma and everything. This is a hard hitter, guys, and it maybe not up your street in that scenario. If you want to just watch a movie to be happy, maybe this isn't for you. But truthfully, I just think the world of this film. And if it is the kind of movie that you think that you would get a lot out of, and having, the leads of Anthony Hopkins and Olivia Colman, I can't understate enough. Olivia Colman has really shone in so many things in this last decade. She's really became one of the leading actresses in anything. And for her, pairing her with Anthony Hopkins for a movie of this nature, that's so emotional and so full of human spirit and humanity as a whole, and it's just a beautiful, beautiful film. And when I get to my number one, I do have to say that it was on personal preference, because I also think it's a masterpiece in a different right. But don't be thinking that this movie didn't touch me emotionally from the start to the end. I loved it. And I do think that it's a movie, if you're in the right mindset, give it a go, for sure. And it was very close to being my number one. But my number one is... Number 1. 1917 is directed by Sam Mendes and stars Dean Charles Chapman and George McKay. Now, talking about masterpieces, and I don't really like to throw that terminology around too much when it comes to these, because there's a difference between loving a film and thinking it's truly a work of cinematic art. But in the case of The Father, and now in the case of 1917, I think they both fall into the category of that in their genre. Because talking about 1917, and again, it is another one that falls into the category of, you might have seen this in 2019, late in 2019, whereas here it was released in January of 2020. So again, I did get very lucky for this list. I'll admit, I hold my hands up, I got very lucky. When I came to writing down, I thought, how am I going to do 2020? How am I going to get 5 films, even? Never mind honourable mentions. But I was very lucky in how things worked out. But taking that away, because I actually remember I got seeing this, I was in London, I was on a trip with my father at the time, and we went to see this in the Leicester Square Theatre, the main one in London, where all the premieres are, and I just thought, a war film? That was all I knew. Just a war film, that's it. Didn't know much about the plot, didn't know the cast, didn't know anything. I just heard a lot of good things, because of course the States had got it about a month before. I think it was like December it was released there, maybe even late November, and I'd heard a lot of really, really good things. People saying it's one of the best war films they've ever seen, and when you think of the war film genre, it's one of the strongest. For me, the only film that I think always stands atop the hill of war films is Saving Private Ryan. Now, you've probably heard that from everybody, but I think it's just hard to deny how fantastic that movie is. In the genre, it's as good as it gets. We've talked about other films like that on 5 of the Best already. We talked about Hacksaw Ridge, for example, a few years back, which I truly, truly love, and it's in my top 5 movies that it comes to war films. But talking about 1917, you're talking about a top 3 for me. I think 1917 is one of the most amazing cinematic experiences. When I talk about different movies that have a real cinema, in the cinema is really where you should experience it, 1917 is absolutely one that falls in that category. Because with it being full of long shots, and a lot of it, yes, there's some recognisable names in here, people like Benedict Cumberbatch and some other actors that you go, oh, well, I recognise him. But for the most part, the realness comes from the unknown of the actors. The 2 actors, and yes, one had been in Game of Thrones at this point, and yes, okay, but not to the level of these are 2 real household names in the 2 leads. And I think when it comes to the reality of a movie, the reality of the movie being made, and the study of realness, and the dedication to the craft of making this feel like it's an actual scenario, only when it's done to the highest level do you get a film like 1917. These long, continuous, ongoing shots that last for minutes upon minutes are just, the whole film feels like one shot, and I know it's shot to be like that. There's only a few instances where that's broken. It's really an unbroken one shot from the start of the film to the end. But take that narrative away, there's still one of the most yes, that's the uniqueness, if you like, of this, and it's really the only war film I've ever seen like this, and that's an achievement on its own. But adding to that some of the most beautiful cinematography, and I mean it, this is the best looking war film ever, or to date. I have not, some of these shots, there's a shot in the film, and this doesn't really spoil anything, but there's a character running through a dimly lit, ruined city with fire in the background, and it is genuinely breathtaking, as is so many parts of this film in different elements. The grittiness and the realness of war is captured so well. And I mean, who am I to ask about knowing what that is? But when you just look at what they're able to encapsulate, this is a movie experience like no other. 1917 is a masterpiece, and I stand by that. I think it is just so truly breathtaking in so many elements. When you see different movies and you go, well, if you see a good comedy film, you go, oh, well, it did make me laugh, but there wasn't really much else to it. Or if you see a good horror film, oh, well, it was kind of scary, but the story wasn't really all that. Or a good thriller, there was some intriguing bits, but I didn't love it from start to finish. 1917, and everything it tackles, whether that be directing, whether that be the story being told, whether that be set pieces, the cinematography, as I've said. There's very little that this movie falls down on, if any. And that's what it came with. Like, I actually rewatched this probably the most recently to doing this video. Probably the most recent film I've seen to watching the 5 of the best. I actually watched it this week that I'm filming it. And I think, I was actually writing like a pros and cons list for this. What do I love? And I've already said about a lot of things I love. But what do I not enjoy about 1917? What on a rewatch do you go, oh, well, actually, that's not that great? Literally nothing. I couldn't think of a flaw for this. This movie is astounding. I think if you're a war film fan or you're just a film fan, 1917 is a movie that you will love. And for both of these films, this and The Father, in vastly different ways. Vastly different ways. They're nearly as different as two films can be. They are both masterpieces of their genre. And for 1917, for war film, for a genre that is so stacked, and I know that's what I said at the start, but I want to emphasize that point. War films as a genre, you could probably think of 20 fantastic war films, but I think 1917 is as close to the top, bar Saving Private Ryan, and that's always at the top for me. It would have to be a hell of a film to knock it off. But 1917 came very close, and that says it all for me. I just think this movie is so good. And 2020 as a year, to have this is what started the year. And you think about me in this scenario, and probably like maybe a lot of you guys who've seen this at the start in January. We also had The Gentleman around this time, and we'd see it in The Invisible Man before things closed. And you're thinking, this is going to be a hell of a movie year. And then we ended up with nothing bar this. Like, I have to say, I struggled to get, anything for the honourable mentions, apart from the two that I saw, and I actually really did enjoy them. We'll talk about them in a wee second. But 1917, put 1917 in any movie year. Literally any. We've done 20 years at this point. We've done the year 2000 all the way to 2020 now. And I think 1917 is a number one, or at the very, very most, a number two, or the very least, I should say, at the very least, a number two in any year that we've done so far. And that says enough about 1917. And that's why it's definitely my favourite film of the year 2020. So that's been the year. The year when everything stopped. I've managed to salvage a 5 of the best episode. Are you proud of me? Because I have to say, I was very lucky. I've said it a few times there. I was very, very lucky with the movies that were released in January here. The Gentleman and 1917 in particular, to both have been released in January, and for me to love them both so much. But let's talk about what nearly made it into the top 5. You'll not believe it, there was 2 that nearly made it into the top 5. And why is that? Because there was only 2 honourable mentions. The other 2 movies that were of any note this year were Soul and Onward. Onward was also around the time I went to see The Invisible Man. It was just before that. I seen it with that same group of friends. We had just got that pass, as I say, and I thought it was one of the better movie kind of family films that I had seen in a while. But it was never to place. It was never removing The Invisible Man from the 5th spot for sure. But the other one was Soul. Jamie Foxx, Pixar, music, jazz music. I like this film a lot. I thought it was one of the more surprising Pixar entries that we've had, and of course it went straight to Disney Plus, which was only really a thing starting at this time, and it was actually quite close to getting into the top 5. It was between Soul and The Invisible Man for me. And Invisible Man had that significance of being the last film I seen before the cinemas closed. Maybe that was what swayed me in the end. But Soul is brilliant too. It nearly broke into the top 5. But overall, 2020 was not a great year in depth for obvious reasons. I love the films of it though, and particularly that top 3. 1917, The Father and The Gentleman are 3 films that I have rewatched you know, it's only, 3 years by this point. I've rewatched them, each of them, at least 2 to 3 times since then. And for that to be such a short period of time between them, because usually when rewatching movies I would give it a bit of time. Some films I don't rewatch for 10 years, even though I absolutely love them. But for these 3, I've rewatched a good few times because they are special, and for them to come out in a time when there was so little depth in the movie genre, there wasn't much to latch on to. You know, it wasn't like these are, and this is a point I want to emphasize and end on, really. It isn't like these are the top 3 because, well, they were the only ones that were half decent. These are 3 movies in particular, and the 5 as a whole, but certainly the top 3 definitely fall into the category of they would make a top 5 for a lot of years that we've talked about, especially with 1917. As I said, 2020 wasn't the disaster of the year that I thought it would be for a movie year. And looking back in retrospective and looking back on what we did get this year, yes, there wasn't much, and I'll give you that. There isn't much depth, there wasn't much to it, but the few that we did that were really good were really good. And yeah, that's been 2020. Moving on to 2021, however, there's a similar element. There's still a little bit of a fallout from what we got in 2020. There's still a little bit less movies that came out in 2021. There still was the tail end of everything that went on. But it gets stronger. It gets stronger in depth. And that will be the next episode. However, if you enjoyed this one, I really, really appreciate you taking the time out of your day to listen to me talking about movies. We're getting so close to... We're close to the present day. We're nearly there. There's only a few more episodes left and then we're up to present day. I really appreciate you taking the time to watch this. I really appreciate you sticking with this series. It's been a series I really enjoy doing. And if you enjoy this one, please leave a like, let me know. Subscribe for more like this if you're new to the channel. And if you do, I will hopefully see you in the next one. Bye, guys. Thanks for taking the time to watch this video. Before you go, here are some of my other videos. For updates and information on upcoming videos, the best place to find us is my Twitter. Much love, everyone.